I think we should talk about what kind of man my son is marrying into. The words landed so quietly they barely disturbed the air. But every fork stopped moving. Every glass stayed on the table. My granddaughter's Christmas playlist kept playing from the corner speaker, something soft and instrumental, but it felt like it was coming from another house entirely. Caroline's mother set down her wine. Her husband straightened in his chair. My son Daniel looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was 9 years old, and had broken the neighbor's window with a baseball. And Vivian, the woman sitting beside him, the woman he planned to marry in 4 months, slowly turned toward her father and said, very quietly, "Dad." He didn't look at her. He was looking at me. He reached into the breast pocket of his sport coat, removed a sealed envelope, and placed it in the center of the table between the breadbasket and the gravy boat. It sat there like a verdict waiting to be read. "We had this prepared by our attorney," he said. "I think you'll agree it's the sensible thing to do." Daniel looked at me. I looked at the envelope. My name wasn't on it. Neither was Daniel's. The only word written on the front, in clean block letters, was the word agreement. I picked it up. "My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I drive a 2003 Ford F-150 with a crack in the dashboard and a heater that takes about 8 minutes to decide whether it's going to work that day. I live in the same house in Knoxville, Tennessee that my wife Helen and I bought 31 years ago. I paint the porch every few years. I mow the grass myself. I eat breakfast at a place called Dot's Diner on Thursday mornings. Because the coffee is strong and Dot still charges $4.50 for eggs and toast, and doesn't apologize about it. People who meet me for the first time usually assume one of two things: that I'm a retired school teacher, or that I'm the kind of man who fixed other people's cars for a living. Neither is correct, but I've never felt the need to say so. What very few people know, including, until 4 months ago, my future daughter-in-law's family, is that I spent 34 years as a federal judge, appointed to the U.S. District Court at 41, elevated to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals at 53. I retired quietly 3 years ago, declined 2 book deals, turned down a position on an advisory board that paid more in 1 year than most people earn in a decade, and drove back to Knoxville in my old truck with a box of personal items from my office and the same sense of relief a man feels when he finally takes off a pair of shoes that were always just slightly too tight. The financial picture that came with that career, Helen and I had managed carefully. She was a tax attorney. We were not extravagant people. We were private people. The house was paid off. The investments were substantial. There was a trust that neither Daniel nor his sister had ever asked about, because I had raised them to believe that asking about money before it mattered was a form of greed we didn't practice in our family. Helen had her own philosophy about wealth. She repeated it the way other women repeated recipes. "Frank," she'd say, usually while she was reading something at the kitchen table, "you can learn everything you need to know about a person by letting them believe the cupboard is bare." I used to think she was being a little dramatic. I don't think that anymore. Helen passed away 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer. She was 63 years old, sharp as a blade until almost the very end. And the last thing she said to me that I understood clearly was, "Watch out for the ones who need to know what you're worth before they decide if you matter." I think about that sentence every single day. Daniel had been with Vivian for almost 2 years when he called me last September to say he was proposing. I told him I was happy. I meant it. She was smart, she laughed easily, and she looked at my son the way Helen used to look at me during arguments, like she was already choosing him even before she'd heard his full explanation. But I had noticed things about her family. Not dramatic things, nothing that would hold up in a conversation. Just the kind of small signals you spend a career learning to recognize. Her mother, Patricia, had a way of asking questions that weren't really questions. "Daniel tells us you're retired, you must be enjoying the slower pace," said warmly with a smile while looking at my truck parked in their driveway. Her father, George Whitmore, was a successful commercial developer out of Nashville, self-made, which I respected. But there was something in the way he spoke to Daniel versus the way he spoke to his own business partners at the engagement dinner, a slight difference in volume, in eye contact, in the speed at which he finished his sentences, that told me he had already filed my son into a category. And then there was Caroline's brother, Marcus, 29 years old. He drove a leased BMW and had recently made a series of comments at family gatherings I had attended to that sat in the air long after he'd said them. When I mentioned I'd worked in law, he nodded politely and said, "Oh, like family law? Wills and stuff?" When I said federal court, he said, "Huh," and changed the subject. When Daniel's sister sent a thoughtful wedding gift in October, Marcus noted, not quite under his breath, "The wrapping's a little much for a candle set." He was never cruel. That's the thing about a certain kind of arrogance. It wears the costume of banter. Vivian saw none of it, or chose not to. She adored her family. That I understood. Daniel was the same way about me. We protect what we love even when the evidence asks us not to. So when Vivian called in November and asked if I'd join them for Thanksgiving at her parents' house in Nashville, I said yes without hesitating. I told her I was looking forward to it. What I did not tell her was that I'd pulled my oldest flannel shirt from the back of the closet, the one with the frayed left cuff. Helen had tried to donate it at least 4 times. I'd kept it because it was soft and because it bothered nobody. I wore it to Thanksgiving, because sometimes you want to see who people are when they believe they've already sized you up. The Whitmore house was impressive without trying to intimidate you, which somehow made it more intimidating. High ceilings, a kitchen that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never actually cooked in one, family portraits on the walls, graduation photos, vacation photos, a framed image of George shaking hands with a Tennessee senator. I happened to know personally, though I said nothing about it. Patricia greeted me at the door with genuine warmth. George shook my hand firmly. Marcus nodded from the couch without standing up. Dinner itself was pleasant. Turkey, sweet potatoes, the usual Thanksgiving scaffolding. The conversation moved easily through sports, through travel, through real estate, George's favorite subject, and one he knew well. I listened more than I spoke. At some point, Marcus mentioned a lawsuit he'd read about. Something about a contractor dispute. He got the legal mechanics completely backwards. I gently offered a small correction. He smiled. "Oh, right, I always forget you did some law stuff." Some law stuff. I looked at the sweet potatoes and nodded. Later, while the dishes were being cleared, Patricia leaned toward Daniel and said something I was not meant to hear but did. "He seems very sweet, a little quiet. Has he been comfortable since he retired?" Daniel said carefully. "He's doing fine." "I only ask," she said, lowering her voice by exactly the wrong number of decibels, "because George has a connection at a property management company, if he ever wanted something part-time, to keep busy." I took a sip of water. Helen's voice came to me from somewhere very calm. "Watch out for the ones who need to know what you're worth before they decide if you matter." I set down my glass. I smiled at nothing in particular, and I waited. The envelope appeared after dessert. The table had been cleared, coffee had been poured, and George Whitmore stood from his chair with the deliberate ease of a man accustomed to being the person in the room who decides when the agenda shifts. He produced the envelope from his coat pocket, placed it in front of me with the same motion you'd use to pass the salt, and said, "Frank, we want to be a family that doesn't have secrets. I hope you'll take this in the spirit it's intended." Patricia added, "It protects everyone." Marcus said nothing. He was scrolling his phone. Daniel went very still. I looked at the envelope. I looked at George. I picked it up. Inside was a premarital financial agreement, professionally prepared, very thorough. It outlined Vivian's assets, which were considerable. She had built a successful interior design firm herself, and it outlined the financial position of her intended spouse and his family. The language was measured, careful, and almost entirely wrong. The document described Daniel as entering the marriage with approximately $40,000 in savings, no substantial assets, and this is the line I read twice, limited inheritance expectations, given the modest circumstances of the paternal family. I read that line again, modest circumstances of the paternal family. I looked up. George was watching me with the practiced calm of a man who expected no pushback. "We think Daniel is a wonderful young man," Patricia said. "This simply clarifies things so everyone begins on solid ground." I nodded slowly. "I appreciate clarity," I said. "I do." Vivian was staring at her coffee. Her jaw was tight. She had not known this was coming tonight. I could see that plainly. Whatever her family had told her about this document, they had not told her it would appear over pumpkin pie. Daniel reached under the table and found my hand. Just briefly. He was 32 years old, and in that moment he was 9 again, asking me without words if everything was going to be all right. I gave his hand one squeeze. Then I turned back to the document. Here is what I have learned from 34 years in federal court. The moment a room goes quiet is never actually quiet. Every person in that room is doing arithmetic. They are calculating what your silence means. They are placing bets on what comes next. George Whitmore had placed his bet. He expected one of two reactions from me. Either I would sign the document because I didn't understand it, or I would bristle because I felt insulted. Either result would give him the information he was after. What he did not expect was the third option. I folded the document back into the envelope and set it beside my coffee cup. I folded my hands on the table, and I said, "May I ask a question?" "Of course," George said, the section describing Daniel's family circumstances. I kept my voice even. "Was that information provided by someone, or was it assumed?" He paused. "Our attorney conducted a standard background review." "I see," I nodded. "And they found modest circumstances." "That was their assessment, yes." "Interesting." I looked at him directly. "Because the trust I established for Daniel at the time of his mother's passing, which is not a public document and would not appear in a standard background review, is worth considerably more than this agreement seems to account for." The room made no sound. "I don't say that to be argumentative," I continued. "I say it because I agree with you completely. Families shouldn't have secrets." Patricia's coffee cup made a small sound against her saucer. Marcus looked up from his phone. Daniel was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before and hoped to always remember. George Whitmore cleared his throat. "I wasn't aware. You weren't meant to be," I said simply. "Daniel has never asked about my finances. I raised him to believe that a man's character was worth more than his balance sheet, and I'm proud that it took." I looked at my son. He never knew. I want that on the record. Here is the part I need to explain, because I have heard the argument before, and I believe it deserves a real answer. There is a version of this story where a man who hides his circumstances and then reveals them at a strategic moment is not humble at all. He is simply performing humility for maximum effect. And that criticism is fair. I have sat with it. What I can tell you is this. I didn't wear the old flannel shirt to trick anyone. I wore it because it is who I am. Helen and I lived in that house and drove that truck and ate at Dot's Diner because those things make a life feel like itself. The money was never the life. It was the scaffolding we built to protect the life. The reveal across George Whitmore's dinner table was not a victory I had been planning since September. It was the only honest response I knew how to make to a document that had gotten my family wrong. But I will tell you one thing it was, which is this. It was the moment I understood that Helen had been right about more than money. George was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something I did not expect. He let out a long breath, leaned back in his chair, and looked at his son. "Marcus," he said. The single word carried enough weight to fill the room. Marcus put his phone on the table. "I want you to think," George said quietly, "about every comment you made at dinner tonight about Daniel's family." Marcus frowned. "Dad, every comment." George's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. About the truck, about the house, about the shirt. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a young man realizing he has been watched more carefully than he thought. "I've been watching you for 2 years, George said. "I set up that agreement tonight because I wanted to see how this family responded under pressure. I wanted to know if they had grace." He looked at me. I got my answer faster than I expected. I said nothing. He continued. "What I also got was an answer I didn't want about someone else at this table." Marcus looked at the floor. "Your grandfather," George said, "drove a truck older than that one for his entire life. He built this company from a toolbox and a borrowed trailer. I never once heard him say an unkind word about a man because of what he drove." Vivian reached across the table and touched her brother's arm. Not in comfort, in solidarity with the truth of what her father was saying. Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Lower. The banter was gone. "I didn't realize how it sounded," he said. "That," his father said gently, "is the problem." Later, after the plates were gone and the football game was muted on the television, George Whitmore came and found me on the back porch. The Nashville evening was cold and clear. Someone down the street had lights on their oak tree. He stood beside me for a moment before he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't." "I do." He slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "I had that document prepared because I wanted to protect my daughter. But somewhere between the attorney's office and tonight, I stopped protecting Vivian and started evaluating Daniel." He paused. "Those aren't the same thing." I looked at the lights on the oak tree. "You raised a good daughter," I said. "She chose a good man. That's what I can tell you." "What did you do?" he asked. "Before you retired." I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed a short, genuine sound, not embarrassed, just surprised. 34 years. 34 years. And you never said anything. Nobody asked. He was quiet again. Then, my father would have liked you. I smiled. The one with the toolbox? The very one. We stood outside for a few more minutes without needing to say much. There are conversations that work better without sentences. Two fathers standing in the cold, each one reassessing what the evening had been. When we went back inside, the envelope was still on the table. George picked it up and slid it across to his wife. "Have Robert shred this," he said. Patricia looked at him. Something passed between them that was private and old and belonged only to them. She put the envelope in her purse and nodded once. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Marcus called me. He didn't warn me he was calling. It came up as an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer. When I heard his voice, it was quieter than I'd heard it at dinner, without the particular brightness that young men use when they want to control a room. "I wanted to say something," he said, without anyone else around. "All right. I've been thinking about what my dad said." A pause. "About Grandpa. Tell me about your grandfather," I said, because I wanted to hear it. He talked for a few minutes about a man who had started a construction company in the 1970s with very little, who wore the same work boots for years until they fell apart, who never talked about what he had built, but showed up every day and built it anyway. "He died when I was 12, Marcus said. "I remember the boots. I remember he always smelled like sawdust." That's a good thing to remember about a man. "I think I forgot what he was telling me," Marcus said quietly. "About the boots." I didn't answer right away. I let that sit where it had landed. Then I said, "You haven't forgotten. You just remembered again. There's a difference." He was quiet. Then, "I'm sorry, Frank, for the comments about the truck and the shirt and everything I made you feel like at that table without realizing I was doing it." "Marcus," I said, "I'd like you to call me something else." A pause. "What?" "Family's a word that comes with titles. You're going to be my son's brother-in-law. You can take a step toward that or away from it. But if you're taking a step toward it, I'd prefer you call me Frank less and call me something warmer more." Another pause. Then a little awkwardly, "Okay, I can do that." "Good," I said. "Okay." His voice had changed entirely. "Thank you. Dad. I mean," he caught himself. Then, carefully, "Thank you." Close enough, I thought. Vivian called me herself the following week. She said she wanted to tell me that she had known about the agreement, that her father had mentioned it was coming, but that she had not known it would appear that night, and she had not known what it said about Daniel's family. "I should have asked to read it first," she said. "I should have stopped it." "Vivian," I said, "you chose my son. That's what you did. That was enough." She was quiet for a moment. "He talks about his mom a lot," she said. "About things she used to say." Helen was worth quoting. "He told me she used to say that you could learn everything about a person by watching how they treated the people they didn't think were important." "Something like that," I said. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I see you, not the judge, not the pension, not whatever the trust document says." She paused. "I see the man who built a wooden bench for his porch because he wanted something to do with his hands after Helen died. Daniel told me about that." I looked out the kitchen window. The bench was still out there. It had taken me most of March to finish it. Helen would have said it was crooked. She would have been right. "That bench is crooked," I told Vivian. She laughed. Daniel said the same thing. "It still holds two people just fine," I said. "I know," she said. "He also told me that." The wedding took place on the second Saturday in April, at a small chapel about 20 minutes outside of Knoxville. It was Vivian's choice. She had driven past it the previous summer and called Daniel from the parking lot because she said the light through the windows looked like the kind of light that belonged to a promise. Daniel told me that story 3 weeks before the wedding, and I had to walk to another room for a moment. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, doing up the buttons of my suit jacket. Helen's photograph was on the dresser. The same photograph that had been there for 31 years, the two of us at the Tennessee River, the summer we got married, both of us squinting into the sun, both of us ridiculous with happiness. I talked to her for a few minutes the way I'd gotten into the habit of doing. I told her that Daniel had chosen well. I told her that the people who had doubted him had found their way to something better, which was the best possible outcome. I told her the bench on the porch was still crooked and that I didn't plan to fix it, Then I picked up my old flannel shirt from the chair by the door. I wasn't going to wear it to the wedding, obviously. I had a suit, but I held it for a moment. Because that shirt had told me something true about several people at a Thanksgiving table, and the truth it had found was one I needed. And because Helen had been right all along, the way she was usually right, and touching the shirt felt like touching a small piece of that. I folded it and put it back on the chair. Then I put on my jacket. I picked up the gift I'd made for them, a small walnut picture frame I'd built and carved with the date of their wedding, and drove to the chapel in my old truck with the cracked dashboard and the heater that took 8 minutes to decide what it wanted to do. At the reception, George Whitmore found me near the window with a glass of sweet tea. "Frank," he said. "George?" He held out his hand. Not for a handshake, he was holding something. A small card. "Robert's number," he said. "Our family attorney. He wants to draw up a proper document acknowledging Daniel as a full partner in this family's estate planning. No assumptions this time." I looked at the card. "George, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." I took the card. He nodded once and moved away toward the buffet table. I stood by the window for a moment and watched my son dancing with his wife in the April light. He caught my eye from across the room and grinned at me, the same grin he'd had at 9 years old, uncomplicated and full of itself in the best possible way. I raised my glass. He raised his. Marcus appeared at my elbow with 2 pieces of wedding cake. He handed me one without asking. We stood side by side watching the dance floor. "You know what I found out last week?" he said. "What's that?" "Dot's Diner." He nodded. "I drove by it. That place has been there since 1974. I looked at him. 52 years. The coffee's actually really good." "I know," I said. "I've been telling you." He smiled. Not the banter smile, the real one. "Thursday mornings," I said. "If you're ever in Knoxville." He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a person nods when they're not just agreeing to the surface of a thing. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." People sometimes ask whether what happened at that Thanksgiving dinner was about money, whether it was about rank or status or proving a point. They're asking the wrong question. Every dollar I earned, every case I decided, every year I sat on that bench in a black robe making decisions that shaped people's lives, none of it came home with me in the way that mattered. Helen came home with me. Daniel came home with me. A house that needed painting every few years, and a truck that required patience, and a diner where Dot still charges $4.50 for eggs and toast. That is what I have. That is what I chose. What the envelope revealed that night was nothing about my net worth. It revealed, with remarkable precision, which people in that room had already decided what I was worth based on my truck and my shirt and my quiet, and which ones, when shown something they had not expected, found the grace to look at themselves instead of looking away. Vivian's father found that grace. He had been testing his own son without fully admitting it, and when the test came back with an answer he didn't like, he did something difficult. He said so out loud, at his own table, in front of his family. Marcus found that grace on a phone call 3 days later. It was quieter and less dramatic, but in my experience, the quieter moments of honesty are the ones that last. My son found it the way he always finds things, by already being in the right place, having learned it from a woman who quoted the truth at him from the time he was old enough to hear it. Helen taught us both. And if you have someone in your life, a parent, a child, a friend you've started seeing differently since their circumstances changed, I hope this story reaches you at the right time. The people we overlook are often the people we needed most. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. And leave a thought in the comments. I read everyone. Some of the wisest things I've encountered lately have come from people who simply took a moment to tell the truth in a comment section. That's a kind of courage too.